Greetings, this is TK Trav, aka Travis Mages, here with LVX 777. Today I'm reading Anatomy of the Star Goddess, written by Iona Miller in 1992. Ashe to the Order of the Unicorn, Ashe to the Order of the Phoenix. Anatomy of the Star Goddess, 1999. The article, originally written as an adjunct to the Diamond Body, is about further investigations into the Kabbalistic and synergetic properties of the vector equilibrium matrix. For placement in synergetic Kabbalah, it has been updated with notions from post-quantum physics and its relevance to the mind-matter interface. Its departure point is Crowley's and the Egyptian notion that infinite space is the goddess Nuit. Here we investigate the archetypal and virtual properties of this star goddess and what that implies in terms of Kabbalistic emanation, the collective conscious, the paranormal, and mind over matter. Her body is the incorporeal matrix underlying the physical universe and the human psyche, underlying all phenomena. When this article was originally written, scalar physics was considered alternative science. Since then, its stock has gone up. There has been a mainstream revolution in Cosmology, Scientific America, January 1999, which confirms the importance of vacuum energy. The standard cosmology of the 1980s, postulating a flat universe dominated by matter, is dead. The universe is either open or filled with an energy of unknown origin. Put another way, nothing could not possibly be more interesting. There are psychological implications, like virtual entities. Images or symbols percolate in and out of consciousness below the threshold of consciousness. They appear much like virtual particles blinking in and out of existence. The newest generation of physics, post-quantum physics, posits a model for mind over matter which operates with quantum backflow that is also relevant to our discussion. This article is not for the intellectually timid. Good luck. Anatomy of the Star Goddess, Quantum Cosmology, Virtual States, Energy Science, Chaos Theory, and Scalar Fields by Iona Miller, circa 1992. Key phrases: infinite space, the void, vacuum, zero-point energy, virtual manifold, VEM as psychotronic machine, virtual state translator, the physics of the plenum, post-quantum physics, synergetic interaction, imagineering, ortho-rotational geometry and dimensions, chaos and complexity, depth psychology, mind-matter interface, nothing becomes something. Abstract. Nuclear engineer and researcher Thomas E. Bearden has proposed a new approach to physics with some startling new theories based on Hugh Everett's many-worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics in 1973. Bearden extends quantum mechanics theory rather than corrupting it. The main thrust of Bearden's work is toward explaining paranormal phenomena, the collective unconscious, weaponry, and other technological possibilities. His new view of physics, energy science, is grounded in what he calls scalar electromagnetics, from which he proposes deriving free energy. This is, in essence, tapping the vector equilibrium matrix for zero-point energy. The key to this technological approach is to let the electromagnetic force fields fight themselves into a cancellation, forming a vector zero. Anti-gravity is just one possibility. Multiple realities contain all possibilities, but in enfolded or virtual states. This theory alleges that there are clustered worlds, which are three-dimensional to an observer within them, yet virtual to an observer from the outside. These hyperspace dimensions are orthogonically rotated 90 degrees in respect to one another. Selecting a frame or cube of space facilitates access. When we consider the vastness of space, we perceive emptiness due to our relative position in this universe. The void is actually densely packed with virtual energy which awaits translation or transduction into our observable three-dimensional reality. These energies or entities appear as virtual because they are unobservable through ordinary means. Crosstalk across these channels is the basis for the collective unconscious, paranormal phenomena, and the manifestation of our material world. Like philosophy, physics is not any absolute description of truth. Rather, both disciplines invite us to look at it this way. This approach is very much in line with the long-standing tradition of speculative Kabbalah and Hermetic philosophy. Quantum Cosmology, the Gross Anatomy of Nuit. This book explains the universe. The elements are Nuit, space, that is, the total of possibilities of every kind, and Hadid, any point which has experience of these possibilities. This idea is for literary convenience, symbolized by the Egyptian goddess Nuit, a woman bending over like the arch of the night sky. Hadid is symbolized as a winged globe at the heart of Nuit. Each one of us has thus an universe of his own, but it is the same universe for each one as soon as it includes all possible experience. This implies the extension of consciousness to include all other consciousness. Aleister Crowley, The Book of the Law. Thomas Bearden's theories bear directly on our investigation of the nature of Nuit and the vector equilibrium matrix. By commenting on the physical and philosophical qualities of the vacuum and attempting to describe how nothing becomes something, Bearden has joined a host of philosophers, mystics, and scientists with an interest in the threshold of our observable universe and what lies beyond. In Excalibur Briefing, Explaining Paranormal Phenomena, 1988, Bearden succinctly outlines this theory, as well as offering several real-time applications in order to relate his ideas and those of Everett to our notions of the VEM. We shall have to draw heavily on his work. We ask the reader's patience with the necessary quotes, but we hope they will simplify the complexity of comprehending even the gross nature of the vector equilibrium matrix. But before we review Bearden's ideas, we will discuss what state-of-the-art quantum cosmology has to say about the nature of reality. Long ago, the Gnostics believed that the true, unrevealed nature of the void was a plenum, or fullness. Modern quantum mechanics has physically verified this intuitive perception of reality. The vacuum of empty space is not empty. It contains energy, zero-point energy, and entities, pure virtual particles. Both the energy field and empty space are in flux, and probably interface with other universes through wormholes or tunnels. Sidney Coleman, a theoretical physicist from Harvard, has been investigating the nature of the vacuum and its relationship to the cosmological constant, zero. He and other physicists can't decide whether the total energy in the vacuum should be positive or negative, but they agree that the energy ought to be huge. Coleman asserts the cosmological constant is zeroed out by wormholes, invisible submicroscopic rips in the fabric of space-time that tunnel out of our universe, linking it to an infinite web of other universes. The rationale of the cosmological constant derives from the uncertainty principle, which applies to variables like energy and time. What it says in this case is that the precision with which you can measure the energy of any system, such as a piece of empty space, is limited by the duration of the measurement. The shorter the time, the greater the precision. And this indeterminacy can never be resolved simply by more accurate measuring instruments. It is inherent in the system itself. Over a short enough time, the system can assume just about any energy, and it does. In a world ruled by quantum mechanics, the energy of the system in any fleeting instant can be seen only as a wave-like function. As a consequence, the vacuum of empty space is not empty. It is pervaded by fluctuating fields of energy that, when large enough, manifest themselves as particles, individual photons, for example, or particle pairs consisting of an ordinary electron or quark and its antimatter twin, which burst into existence and then annihilate. The vacuum is thick with these short-lived virtual particles. It looks empty only because each particle's visit to existence, according to the uncertainty principle, is so infinitesimally brief as to be undetectable. But the effects of these virtual particles in mass may be detectable. virtual particles ought to have one effect in particular. Their energy ought to warp space. The deformation would be entirely independent of that wrought by ordinary matter, and so, Einstein notwithstanding, it would constitute a non-zero cosmological constant. How big would the constant be? That depends on how often virtual particles appear in a given volume of space, and it also depends on the type of particles. Virtual quarks and electrons have much the same effect as their real counterparts. They cause space to contract. But virtual photons, or any other force-transmitting particles, have the opposite.
Excuse me, share successful.
They cause space to expand. There are a whole bunch of things that contribute to the cosmological constant. Some are plus, some are minus, so we expect some of them to cancel, but not the whole lot. The cosmological constant is very nearly zero. The mechanism, according to Coleman, is similar to virtual particles in that it arises from quantum fluctuations, but this time the fluctuations aren't those of energy fields, zero-point energy. They are fluctuations of empty space itself, vector equilibrium fluctuations. Stephen Hawking invented the quantum wormhole in 1988. Just as quantum mechanics says there is a certain probability that particles can appear from nowhere in the vacuum, quantum cosmology says there may be a certain probability that a small chunk of space and time will suddenly pop into existence. That is what a wormhole is. A fluctuation in the space-time field, just as a virtual particle is a fluctuation in an energy field. The wormhole could connect to any one of an endless number of pre-existing parallel universes that are otherwise inaccessible to us. There is no reason to assume our universe is the only one. Webs of parallel universes are equally possible. They can be imagined like balloons connected to one another by thin, rubbery necks of space-time. Those are the wormholes. The regions inside and outside the balloons and wormholes are outside space-time. It doesn't exist. One meaningful consequence of wormholes is that they might contribute information to our universe in the form of values for the constants of nature. They might also fix the energy density of the vacuum, the cosmological constant. Somehow, wormholes arrange things so that the value of the cosmological constant is zero, so that the huge particle components cancel exactly. According to quantum cosmology, this is by far the most likely outcome. Zero-point energy is the kinetic energy that remains in a substance when its temperature is absolute zero. The vacuum has zero-point energy also. Any potential is just a bunch of trapped dynamic vectors, hence trapped vector translational energy. It is translational energy that is locally trapped and not translating. The potential is thus like an accumulator or capacitor. It can be charged up and discharged. The vacuum is increasingly being regarded as composed of an incredibly dense structure of virtual electromagnetic energy, even at 0 degrees absolute. Superspace consists of pure, massless charged flux, pure scalar waves. If compacted, this energy density of the vacuum is enormous. Here in the vacuum, space-time is incredibly dense, and matter is etherically thin. Space-time goes through matter rather than matter going through space-time, and this energy density of the vacuum does interact with electromagnetic fields and matter to give observable effects such as the Lamb shift. In his inflationary model of the hot Big Bang, Alan H. Guth considers matter to consist of scalar field particles, Scientific American, December 1991. Such field particles are not the stuff of everyday life, but they do arise naturally in many theories. Indeed, they are believed to be the dominant form of matter under the extremely high energy conditions similar to those in the early universe. According to the inflationary model, they lead to a kind of negative pressure. Gravity effectively becomes a repulsive force and inflation occurs. At the end of the inflationary era, the decay of the scalar field matter producing the expansion heated the initially cold universe to a very high temperature. Although the scalar field is largely homogeneous, it still may have small inhomogeneous parts. According to quantum theory, these inhomogeneous parts cannot be exactly zero, but must be subject to small quantum fluctuations. In fact, All types of matter are subject to such quantum effects, but for most purposes, the fluctuations are so small as to be totally insignificant. The rapid expansion of the universe during inflation magnified these initially insignificant microscopic fluctuations, transforming them into macroscopic changes in density. Reference chaos theory, and the pumping up of micro to macroscopic changes is one of the characteristics of chaos. Inflation itself depends on a number of assumptions. For example, it would have occurred only if the scalar field began with a large, approximately constant energy density. This approximately constant energy density is equivalent, at least for a brief time, to Einstein's famous or infamous cosmological constant. Therefore, like it or not, the success of inflation rests on certain assumptions about initial conditions, another aspect of chaos theory. What happened before inflation? How did the universe actually begin? In the pre-inflation era, the size of the universe tends to be zero, and the strength of the gravitational field and the energy density of matter tend to infinity. That is, the universe appears to have emerged from a singularity, a region of infinite curvature and energy density at which the known laws of physics break down. Near a singularity, space-time becomes highly curved. Its volume shrinks to very small dimensions. Under such circumstances, one must appeal to the theory of the very small, that is, to quantum theory. In quantum mechanics, motion is not deterministic, but probabilistic. A quantity called the wave function encodes the probabilistic information about such variables as position, momentum, and energy. For a single point particle, one can regard the wave function as an oscillating field spread throughout physical space. Because of the uncertainty principle, the kinetic and potential energy of a system cannot both be exactly zero. Instead, the system has a ground state in which the energy is as low as it can be. Recall that in the inflationary universe, galaxies form from ground state fluctuations. Such fluctuations also prevent the orbiting electron from crashing into the nucleus. The electrons have an orbit of minimum energy from which they cannot fall into the nucleus without violating the uncertainty principle. Though it is still considered an extravagant claim, the fundamental assertion of quantum cosmology is that quantum mechanics applies to the entire universe at all times and to everything in it. In a theory of the universe, of which the observer is a part, there should be no fundamental division between observer and observed. The wave function of the entire universe can't collapse each time an observation is made. In cosmology, there is only one system, which is measured only once. Hugh Everett III of Princeton, 1930 to 1982, asserted that there exists a universal wave function describing both macroscopic observers and microscopic systems with no fundamental division between them. A measurement is just an interaction between different parts of the entire universe, and the wave function should predict what one part of the system sees when it observes another. So, there is no collapse of the wave function, only a smooth evolution described by the Schrödinger wave equation of the entire system. But as he modeled the measurement process, Everett made a truly remarkable discovery. The measurement appears to cause the universe to split into sufficiently many copies of itself to take into account all possible outcomes of the measurement. This has been discounted by others into possible histories for the universe with assigned probabilities. For practical purposes, it does not matter if we think of all or just one of them as actually happening. Certain regions, as those close to classical singularities, exist in which no prediction is possible. There, the notions of space and time quite simply do not exist. There is just a quantum fuzz, still describable by known laws of quantum physics, but not by classical laws. It may be subject to the laws of quantum chaos. Inflation is assumed as one of the quantum initial conditions. The inescapable task of the quantum cosmologists is to propose laws of initial or boundary conditions for the universe. Stephen Hawking's idea is called the no-boundary proposal, which admits many possible histories. Perhaps the universe has tunneled from nothing. The evolution described by inflation and the Big Bang would have subsequently occurred after tunneling. This is consistent with the Kabbalistic explanation of the emanation of Kether from Ein Sof, and Ein Sof are, the veils of negative existence. The picture that emerges is of a universe with non-zero size and finite, rather than infinite, energy, density appearing from a quantum fuzz. After quantum creation, the wave function assigns probabilities to different evolutionary paths, one of which includes the inflation postulated by Duff. Although some theorists disagree, both the no-boundary and tunneling proposals seem to predict the conditions necessary for inflation, thereby eliminating the need for assumptions about the scalar field matter that drove the rapid expansion. The no-boundary and tunneling proposals eliminate assumptions about the density perturbations. Although inflation explains their origin, the exact form and magnitude depend on certain assumptions about the initial state of the scalar field matter. The inflation model assumes the inhomogeneous parts started out in their quantum mechanical ground state, the lowest possible energy state consistent with the uncertainty principle. But Hawking's no-boundary proposal states that everything must be smooth and regular on the bottom cap of the space-time tube. The condition implies that inhomogeneous fluctuations must be zero there. The fluctuations enter real time as small as they can be, as the quantum mechanical ground state fluctuations demanded by the inflation model. The tunneling proposal makes the same prediction for similar reasons. So, quantum cosmology alleges the universe appeared from a quantum fuzz, tunneling into existence and thereafter evolving classically. Quantum creation scenarios produce gravitational waves of a calculable form and magnitude. Gravitational waves interact very weakly with matter as they propagate through spacetime. Therefore, when we observe them in the present universe, their spectrum may still contain the signature of quantum creation. But gravity waves are hard to detect, so quantum cosmology can't be verified conclusively to determine whether the no-boundary or tunneling proposals are the correct ones for the wave function of the universe. But, so far, these are the best guesses, and they do not contradict the Kabbalistic notion. Energy science and scalar fields. How does Bearden's energy science relate to quantum cosmology, the vacuum, and vector equilibrium? Through scalars and scalar fields, the virtual vacuum plasma, virtual particle vacuum ether. A scalar is a vector characterized by magnitude and time. Scalar waves, virtual particle flux wave, in the virtual state, massless charge flux, which is vacuum, do not reach the quantum level to become observable, yet they are real. They are oscillations of the stress energy tensor of the vacuum. In the vacuum state, everything is disintegrated but highly dynamic. The vacuum is not an emptiness filled with massless charge, rather it is identically massless charge, disintegrated dynamicism. It is a plenum, not an emptiness. It is also pure, undifferentiated action. Multiple vectors acting on one point and summing or multiplying to zero, vector equilibrium matrix, are physically still present, even though their vector resultant is a zero factor. Thus, physically a zero vector can be a system having a very real, distinct substructure of non-zero vector components. These enfolded vector components may be highly dynamic, i.e. chaotic. The an energy of each enfolded dynamic vector component is thus trapped inside the local vector zero system. An energy is the stress energy of the vacuum. Fragments of energy, from more subtle than electromagnetic energy, turned against themselves, are locked into a vector zero summation. This is modeled as scalar massless charge flux or virtual particle flux, or pieces of the spatiotemporal vacuum space-time medium. These observable virtual an energy particles are rotated more than 90 degrees from a laboratory space. An energy particles are the individual scalar wave components of vector electromagnetic waves. An energy components may be coupled into energy, which can be compacted into mass. Scalar fields exist for each point in space, hadid, which enfolds n-dimensional virtual state substructures. Each succeedingly higher dimension is a succeedingly lower level of a virtual state. The vacuum itself is such a scalar field. This massless charge field enfolds vast electrostatic scalar potential. Standing scalar waves can be coupled at exactly 180 degrees out of phase in a resonant cavity to create zero sums through scalar resonance. There is just such a resonant cavity in the brain between the pituitary and pineal glands. These waves of potential co-modulate each other and lock or zip together as a zero-vector system wave. This allows for crosstalk or translation between dimensions. Dimensions have certain primary geometrical physical attributes, such as length, used to describe the separational relationships of physical phenomena. By geometrical, we mean that the dimension is considered to exist in either the presence or absence of the observable physical phenomena. However, by agreement, the dimension of itself is not directly observable, yet it can be inferred by measurement. Hyperchannels for crosstalk between dimensions are known as magic windows. These interdimensional nodal points have a naturally tuned frequency of a good hyperchannel between orthogonal frames where scalar wave energies crosstalk readily. Crosstalk normally means the transfer of energy or signal from one channel to another by cross-modulation or cross-couplings between the channels. In this new approach, it refers to the virtual energy exchange between orthogonal universes or frames, that is, between different 3- or 4-dimensional slices of an infinite dimensional universe. Magic windows are frequently dependent. Some magic windows are 38 to 40 kHz, 150 to 160 kHz, 1.1 to 1.3 MHz, 1.057 lamp shift, and in the near ultraviolet frequency. These frequencies represent enhanced channels between subquantal, virtual, and spatial, observable states. A particularly good magic window exists when the infrared and ultraviolet bands being utilized are phase-locked so that the ultraviolet represents the first harmonic of the infrared. Also known as a Tesla wave, this standing scalar wave can be seen alternatively as a time wave or gravitational wave. It is a wave of pure potential. It is a longitudinal scalar potential wave in massless charge, in the vacuum charge flux itself, and in pure space-time. Since there are no spinning charged mass particles, it does not form a vector electromagnetic wave, as conventional theory would predict. It breaks into shadowy virtual vectors which are not integrated. Rigorously vector fields cannot exist in a vacuum, but can only exist in an observable mass. A shadow vector field can exist in a vacuum. In the absence of observable mass, it exists as small virtual vectors, each existing as a virtual particle in the vacuum. Such a shadow vector field may be regarded as two coupled scalar fields, where the coupling is performed by the virtual particle flux of which the vacuum itself consists. If this same holds true for the collective unconscious, it may be a physical analog for the unintegratable aspects of the archetypes in human personality. Resonating standing scalar waves in the brain may be the physical interface for archetypes. Since the vectors of vector equilibrium represent the paths of least resistance, they may represent preferred pathways in the brain, as suggested by the chronic reappearance of archetypal patterns. Classical brain waves are only the residue or spillage waves of the brain. The important activity is in the specific patterning of the vector zero summations of the myriads of ion discharges. Every discharge ion constitutes a small electromagnetic force vector. The summation of these vectors is largely zeroed. However, the patterns formed by all these tiny components are not random. The intent and will of the human being is expressed in the changes in the patterning of these dynamic substructures. Present electromagnetic brainwave theory does not touch the basic thought patterns, which are scalar in nature. Consciousness refers, among other things, to the intersecting stream of monocular, one at a time virtual projections into the mind from the quantum changes of photon interactions upon the body sensors, to be explained fully more later. Memory gives the entity the illusion of moving through time. In the absence of deeper understanding, the individual consciously sees itself as a separated physical object moving and changing in time with respect to other separated objects that it perceives. The externality of certain changes in the physical world is due to the lack of mental control or influence over them. Internality of certain other changes is due to the ability to mentally control or influence them. The ordinary conscious mind is a serial processor. Only one thing at a time is discriminated in its awareness. But the unconscious mind is totally conscious, but multiplies so since it is a parallel processor of many discriminations at once. The linear mind cannot directly perceive the individual discriminations of the parallel processor, since these appear only as a blur or nothingness to it. This is the mechanism of the barrier between the conscious and the unconscious minds. Let me read that again. The linear mind cannot directly perceive the individual discriminations of the parallel processor, since these appear only as a blur or nothingness to it. This is the mechanism of the barrier between the conscious and the unconscious minds. Projections from the unconscious onto the scenes of the conscious mind will thus appear symbolical, that is, having many hidden meanings at once. This is why our dreams, for example, appear to our conscious minds as weird and distorted, but highly symbolic in nature. The mind is a world composed of separation events, waves, operations, processes, in unseparated being. We may model it as a physical universe, 3 orthogonal turns away from the ordinary physical universe, and tuned slightly selectively to one physical organism's body processes. Eastern masters have always told us that all reality is mind stuff. Now we can model that process. Mind and energy is considered to be progressively collected, condensed, and kindled into denser substance and objects by rotation toward the ordinary physical world. Thus, a piece of inert matter is simply condensed energy, which itself is condensed energy, which is condensed mind flux, crosstalk, from all minds, collective unconscious. We may model the mind physically, or model the physical as mind stuff, eliminating the artificial dichotomy between mind and matter that presently is assumed in orthodox science. The vector equilibrium matrix and diamond body are cyclotronic generators for amplifying and translating mind stuff. They are devices for producing observable effects by collecting, condensing, amplifying, and or processing subtle energies or scalar waves. Cyclotronic devices are virtual state engineering devices that process and utilize scalar electromagnetic waves of massless charge flux. Light and time. A photon is the basic action quantum. It may be considered as an oscillation in and out of time. It may also be considered as a virtual pattern of positron-electron pairs. It is a piece of electromagnetic radiation when it interacts as a particle. One half of the photon exists in and carries positive time, negative charge, and the other half exists in and carries negative time, positive charge. Thus, one half is normal and the other half is time reversed, phase conjugated. The photon may be considered as one cycle of an electromagnetic wave. The photon is the basic carrier of time. It consists of a piece of energy welded to a piece of time with no seam in the middle. The passage of time thus moves at the speed of light, its carrier. When its magnitude diminishes below the quantum threshold, a photon becomes a virtual photon, whose emission and absorption cause charge on an electron. Photon interaction is the absorption and emission of photons by particles or objects. The macroscopic world is created by this interaction, which is the basic quantum change interaction. Scalar waves are emitted and absorbed by the nuclei of atoms, passing right through the electron shells without interaction. When we introduce additional scalar interactions beyond the ambient background, the nuclei change appreciably, though this level of physical reality may be far from stable. This is the higher reality, and it is sensed by the scalar electromagnetic functioning of our nervous system. Unfortunately, this system outputs only to the deep unconscious, since it is highly multiocular. Thus, our conscious mind, being monocular, does not perceive the most fundamental reality in which we exist. Time is the special dimension in which multiple objects can exist simultaneously in the same interval. Time is multi-ocular and space is monocular. Our conscious mind is fitted to the monocular photon interaction. The monocular, our conscious mind cannot be aware of time directly. For that reason, we do not see time consciously. We do see it, however, unconsciously. The true meaning of being lost is to be separated from the consciousness of the all, which is separation of our consciousness, gross sensing from our finer, more subtle, and infinitely richer and unconscious scalar sensing of ultimate reality. Because the effect of photon emission is carrying away time, it forms a filter between our senses and fundamental reality. This time differentiation of fundamental reality eliminates our ability to detect those things which occupy time but not normal three-dimensional space, such as mind, thought, etc. Almost all our thoughts, concepts, words, and ideas are fitted to this partial reality, and this is the universal human problem and delusion. Einstein alleged that our language demands Cartesian coordinates and thus limits our thinking. We see a spatial universe of separated spatial objects, while in actuality we exist in an undifferentiated single wholeness. The mind world and the physical world, mind and matter, have in common the same time dimension. Dynamic movements in each result in small crosstalk being projected into the other world, a crosstalk so small as to be virtual and normally unmeasurable. The photon interaction invokes a time differentiating operation, stripping away or suppressing the time dimension, resulting in a spatial reality or objective reality being perceived or observed. In this process, it separates mind and body by destroying the only common connection or channel. The photon interaction is the agent that creates subjectivity itself. The photon interaction separates space-time into space and time exclusively. An object, being something which occupies space, is thus timeless. Objects do not exist in time, because the union of an object and time constitutes space-time, which cannot be perceived, detected, or observed. Only changes and derivations of space-time can be perceived, detected, or observed, but not space-time itself. That with which light has not interacted is not objective. That with which light has not interacted is not objective. The concept of mass is not a function of time, but only a function of space. It is thus three-dimensional. The photon is also three-dimensional, but one of its dimensions is the time dimension. When the photon strikes the mass and is absorbed, one portion is turned into mass by ortho-rotating one turn. Its compound nucleus of spacetime is not perceivable. When a photon is re-emitted, it may or may not be of the same frequency and energy as the previously absorbed photon, depending on the absence or presence of any other perturbations. A small bit of spatial mass is ortho-rotated, which turns the bit of mass into a small piece of energy. In the rotation, a small piece of time is bitten off and yields a quantum of action, which now constitutes a photon. Photon emission thus strips away the time dimensions, leaving a spatial object. Einstein pointed out that the velocity of an object may be visualized as rotation of an object in a higher dimensional space, visualized as spatial rotation rather than rotation toward the time axis. The velocity of light in a vacuum merely constitutes the rotation of a piece of mass by an angle of 90 degrees to the line of motion, and the lab space in which we visualize the photon, the rotated piece of mass, as moving. The space-time compound nucleus has now once again been separated into spatial and time components. Time is moving with the photon, and that is why time moves or flows at c, the speed of light in a vacuum. Time is carried only by the photon, and photon interaction with an object produces that object's march through time. We perceive stability within change because we cannot detect, perceive, or observe the compound nucleus of spacetime in the middle. Thus, we experience change as a thing becoming something else, but still being the same thing. Virtual reality check. Virtual state That part of physical reality consisting of changes, particles, waves, and other entities, smaller than the least detectable quantum change, disintegrated changes. A thought or thought form is also virtual. May be visualized as consisting of real, dynamic pieces of vacuum or pieces of nothing. Every ordinary observable particle, photon, neutron, electron, proton, etc., contains or consists of a dynamically changing cloud of virtual objects. Exchange of virtual objects is thought to generate almost all forces of nature. The mind may be considered a special virtual universe, and thought a virtual object. Virtual states consist of multiply nested levels, each level progressively finer and more subtle. These sublevels also correspond mathematically to higher geometrical dimensions. That's by Thomas Bearden in the Excalibur briefing. The body electric. Our understanding of the processes which go on below the quantum level adds another nuance to our metaphysical concepts of the subtle body, the relationship of mind and matter, and the relative nature of reality. Whatever we find out about the nature of this realm and its relationship to mass applies to our own bodies and minds as well. We are one and the same as the structures that underlie the matter and energy of our gross structure. That structure is continuous, interconnected, and non-local in nature. We have enfolded within our being an underlying reality even more fundamental than the structure behind the interconnected wave patterns described by quantum mechanics. This massless counterpoint to our being has its basis in non-being. To conceive of its nature, we must penetrate not only into the void, but beyond, looking through the looking glass into a dimension where chaos is the norm. Whatever this world is, we are that. You share the same anatomy as the star goddess. The elements of your body were cooked in the crucible of some long exploded supernova. This very ephemeral virtual ether translates itself into matter by turning and turning on its gyres, transforming itself from nothing into something. We perceive it as real-time effect as electricity, without really comprehending what that energy is. It is well known that all mass is charged, thus everything in one sense is electricity. To examine this concept, let us look again at the electron with its virtual photons being emitted and absorbed, which virtual activity creates the electric field of the electron. According to Bearden, the electric field constitutes a steady activity of the emission and absorption of virtual photons. The electron spin is more of an implosion or explosion in higher dimensional space. Spin is occurring in at least 4 spatial dimensions, not just 3. It is more of an implosion or explosion into and out of this 3-space universe frame. We might visualize the implosive or explosive spin as similar to vector flux. 2 like-charged particles with precisely anti-parallel spin run right through each other when they meet, with no interaction at all, electrical or otherwise. This successful experiment at Argonne National Laboratory disproved the old idea of concrete, solid material reality. Yet once again, we are that. In the middle of being is non-being. Before we leave the descriptions of the subquantal electrical activity of the body, we can examine some of the implications of bioelectromagnetism. The most prominent researcher in this area is Robert O. Becker. Becker is famous for his research on applying electrical fields to the body for healing and tissue regeneration, but he has also done experiments relating the application of electromagnetic currents to the brain and results on consciousness. Some of the most interesting are recounted in The Body Electric, co-authored by Gary Selden, 1985. We also found we could work backward using the DC currents to produce anesthesia, a strong enough magnetic field oriented at right angles, orthogonal, to a current magnetically clamped to it, stopping the flow. By placing frogs and salamanders between the poles of an electromagnet so that the back-to-front current in their heads was perpendicular to the magnetic lines of force, we could anesthetize the animals just as well as we could with chemicals, and EEG recordings of magnetic and chemical anesthesia were identical. We got the same effect by passing a current through the brain from front to back, canceling out the normal current of waking consciousness as in electrosleep. Becker's further comments bear on the mind-body interface and give a physiological mechanism for hypnosis. It tangibly demonstrates mind over matter. He recounts his physical findings from hypnotized subjects. In each case, I found that the frontal negative potential of the head became less negative, often reaching zero as the client attained deep trance. The reading changed in the same direction as in anesthesia, only not as far. Then, when a suggestion for pain control was given, the arm potential reversed just as it had in response to procaine. Conversely, when a control subject was asked in normal waking consciousness to concentrate forcefully on one arm, its sensitivity to pain increased, and the hand potential became more negative. We found we could use this difference to determine whether a person was really hypnotized or just cooperating. Some doubters, including myself, I'm afraid, had believed hypoanalgesia was merely a state in which the patient still felt the pain but didn't respond to it. But these experiments proved it was a real blockage of pain perception. It seems that the brain can shut off pain by altering the direct current potentials in the rest of the body at will. There is every reason to suppose that pain control through biofeedback or yoga likewise works by using an innate circuit for attenuating the pain signal, which releases a shot of the body's own painkillers. When the signal is appropriately modulated, it releases endorphins, internally produced opiates. I predict that research on this system will eventually let us learn to control pain, healing, and growth with our minds alone, substantially reducing the need for physicians. We know, on the psychological level, that a person's emotions affect the efficiency of healing and the level of pain, and there is every reason to believe that emotions on the physiological level have their effect by modulating the current that directly controls pain and healing. Electromagnetic fields, action, creation, and time. Every physical change of a charged particle, from proton to neutron to electron, constitutes a modulation imposed upon its virtual photonic activity, creating its electromagnetic field. These modulations collect, become coherent, and breach the threshold of the virtual dimension. It, in turn, amplifies the signal or information, passing to the frame of the electromagnetic field. The electromagnetic field plays an integral role in coupling the virtual state reality to observable state reality. Action, according to physics, is the fundamental constituent of physical reality. In metaphysics, action is the agent of karma, producing natural consequences. Action is non-observable. Only changes in action are observed, and then only partially. The photon is the basic quantum of action, uniting energy and time. All physical things are composed of rates of changes in action. These action changes are totally internal to the mass itself. Therefore, literally, the physical universe exists inside each and every part of itself and is a giant hologram. An ordinary photon has a certain size that is quite fixed, and it is made of the substance action, which is totally non-perceivable and non-observable. Only changes in action are perceivable, observable, or detectable, never fundamental action itself. So physics already prescribes a universe made out of action, and that universe has no length, no time, no energy, no space, no concrete existence. Yet, from it can be taken, by differentiation, which is simply separation, any length, any time, any energy. However, only a single quantum at a time changes or is separated. Quanta do not superimpose. At its most fundamental level, the entire universe is continually being created and then destroyed in sequence. The continual creation of a tiny piece of time and then the destruction of the piece of time makes us experience reality or change as if we were a pointer moving along a timeline. We cannot see time because it is continually being destroyed by the change process, the very process of physical detection or observation itself. This is similar to the annihilation of a photon when it hits the retina and becomes absorbed. Now, if we invoke another kind of change, a virtual change, such that its size is always smaller than the actual quantum size, then this kind of change cannot be detected, even theoretically. The concept of a virtual change is one such that the quantity of action that was changed was deliberately made smaller than the size required to throw the switch of detectable or observable change. It is an infinitesimally small perturbation. Individually, virtual photons cannot reach the threshold of quantum change, and so cannot be observed or detected. But in concert, they do reach the threshold. The totally unobservable, undetectable virtual photons being emitted and absorbed are conceived as creating the electric field at the same time as observable physical change, ordinary quantum change, occurs. The electric field, of course, can cause or induce change of sufficient magnitude to reach the quantum threshold and result in observable change. The bottom line is this. The virtual state can be collated and collected to sufficient magnitude to reach the quantum threshold and induce ordinary observable physical change. The electromagnetic field already does precisely this. We can coherently collect the virtual state to produce matter or its antimatter, which after all are nothing but macroscopic assemblages of quantum changes, and we can thus get free energy, materialization and dematerialization, teleportation and anti-gravity by means of special modifications and development of electromagnetic circuits. Each photon carries a small piece of time, and the entire virtual state reality is hanging on to that small piece of time as a modulation. That is where the probabilities are riding, in terms of the ordinary monocular interpretation of quantum mechanics. All the probabilities and possibilities are concretely real and occupy orthogonal universes. Since they all share the same single time dimension, there is a time bridge or time channel, QM wormholes, connecting the universe. Each move or change in one of them crosstalks a tiny bit into each of the others. Since it is the photon which carries them, then each photon contains all possibilities and virtual states modulated upon itself. Photon interaction thus involves the communication of these possibilities and virtual states to the object which the interaction occurs. The virtual state cyclotronic modulations of the mass electric field are now riding on the virtual photons that generate that field. Every possibility concretely exists in that manner, in the virtual state, time-wise hanging on to the time dimension of the detected physical world's 4-space frame, but space-wise hanging out of the ordinary 3-space physical universe of objects. So indeed, all possible realities, even the wildest and most far-fetched, exist in the virtual state. The time channel is quite literally a paranormal channel that connects the normal spatial world to an infinity of non-normal spatial world frames. Only by the continual destruction of each piece of created time, by fusing it back together with the piece of energy involved, and forming a quantum which is unperceivable, are we able to experience physical reality at all, uncluttered and relatively free from the vast hordes of infinite realities through which the ship of quantum change physical reality sails. Since the electromagnetic field represents a collection of this vast array of realities, then by proper selection, i.e. by coherent tuning of multiple stages, we should be able to select a particular virtual reality channel, and indeed so we can. Any scheme for drastically increasing signal-to-noise ratios should be adoptable to such a collection mechanism for the detection of bioenergy. True enough, to the physicist. Into the core of nature, O Philistine, no earthly mind can enter. The maxim is fine. But have the grace to spare the dissenter. Me and my kind, we think in every place. We're at the center. Happy the mortal creature to whom shows no more than the outer rind. For 60 years I've heard your short announce. It makes me swear, though quietly. To myself 1,000 times I say, all things she grants gladly and lavishly. Nature has neither core nor outer rind, being all things at once. It's yourself you should scrutinize to see whether you're center or periphery. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Let me read that little poem one more time. Into the core of nature, O Philistine, no earthly mind can enter. The maxim is fine, but to have the grace to spare the dissenter, me and my kind. We think in every place we're at the center. Happy the mortal creature to whom she shows no more than the outer rind. For 60 years I've heard your short announce. It makes me swear, though quietly, to myself 1,000 times I say, all things she grants gladly and lavishly. Nature has neither core nor outer rind, but all things at once. It's yourself you should scrutinize to see whether you're center or periphery. Follow me now into a much deeper level than ordinary thought, down into the atomic realm, the subatomic realm, and yes, the subquantum realm, deeper than the void, into the looking glass universe. Theoretical physicists are used to visualizing a world which is removed from tangible objects by two levels of abstraction. From tangible atoms, we move one level of abstraction to invisible fields and particles. A second level of abstraction takes us from field and particles to the symmetry groups by which fields and particles are related. The introduction of superstring theory has stretched scientific minds even further. Superstring theory takes us beyond symmetry groups to two other levels of abstractions. The third level of abstraction is the interpretations of symmetry, groups in terms of states in 10-dimensional space-time. Sound Kabbalistic. The fourth level is the world of superstring, by whose dynamical behavior the states are defined. We are inviting you also into these rarefied events beyond the observable limits of nature, at the core of the core, as far within as we dare speculate. Scalar phenomena, while not directly visible, can be inferred. The discerning will find that their own nature is truly reflected here, and its name is mystery. So come into the mystic. Now, the following is paraphrased, quoted, or synopsized from Excalibur Briefing, Explaining Paranormal Phenomena, 1988, Strawberry Hill Press, by Thomas E. Bearden, who is a retired lieutenant colonel, U.S. Army. It has been condensed and juggled to accentuate its relationship to Buckminster Fuller's description of the vector equilibrium matrix, a zero-vector system. We hope to use this new approach to quantum physics to further reveal the cyclotronic properties of the diamond body in synergetic Kabbalah. We also hope to relate it to theoretic Kabbalah and consciousness studies. To simplify this theory for the reader, we have eliminated the equations. See the book for the mathematical proofs. This and other books by Bearden on paranormal phenomena and weird science can be ordered directly from Tesla Book Company, P.O. Box 1649, Greenville, Texas, 75401. Thomas Bearden's Scalar Electromagnetics. Let us use as a definition of reality. Reality is that which can be conceptually and mathematically modeled and fitted to the phenomena existing in one or more minds. Physical reality is that which can be modeled and fitted to the phenomena in one mind. Mental and physical realities comprise normal reality. Complex or paranormal reality is that which can be conceptually and mathematically modeled and fitted to phenomena which exist in more than one mind, but not in all minds. From pure nothing, empty vacuum, absence of thing, one can generate everything, the presence of thing. Here is direct proof that ultimately opposites are identical. There is identity of opposites on their common boundary. Thomas E. Bearden, nuclear engineer. The conventional interpretation of relativity considers only a single observer at a time, monocular. Change as seen by multiple simultaneous observers, multiocular, leads to an infinite dimensional multi-world or multi-universe similar to that postulated by Hugh Everett in 1973. In the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, essentially all possibilities exist and are. Each world splits into multiple possibilities after each and every event. Though consistent with the entire experimental basis of quantum physics today, this is a reality where all possibilities are physically real in their own dimension through virtual entities to an observer in another dimension. Physical reality is not absolute. This can be shown experimentally. Two colliding protons pass right through each other in total violation of all physical rules if their spins are exactly parallel. In vector equilibrium, waves pass through waves without interference. Protons are the central building blocks of all matter, the fundamental constituents of everything solid and concrete. Yet, they go right through one another without any effect whatsoever when their spins are aligned properly, simply canceling physical reality. There is no independent existence to mental phenomena. There is a perception operation involved when we think. There is no independent existence to physical phenomena. There is a perception operation involved when we observe physical phenomena. Furthermore, it takes a finite piece of time for the perception process to occur. At the boundary of exact opposites, all that is necessary to identify opposites is to lose all perceptual distinction between them, and that is accomplished by multi-ocular perception, perceiving the presence of both at once unseparated, hence the absence of either exclusively present. Nothing simply consists of the presence of the totality of all opposites. It is a contemporary form of the alchemical union of the opposites, or the psychological notion of holding the tension of the opposites. But separate time intervals are required for finite monocular perceptions. The laws of logic are simply the laws of the operation of perception. Nothing more, nothing less. The ordinary laws of logic apply only away from a boundary. The boundary threshold, or liminal area, invokes the law of paradox. Identifying opposites simply consists of packing together two previously separated perceptions into a single third unseparated perception. Every single perceived thing has a boundary where it both begins and ends its exclusive presence or in-perception output. In any perception, ordinary logic and paradox are applied. Ordinary logic is explicit and paradox implicit, or conversely, ordinary logic is implicit and paradox explicit. New definition of zero. To a monocular perception process, multiple presence constitutes absence of the exclusive presence of any particular one. Therefore, such a multiple presence is monocularly unperceivable and hence becomes a zero to a monocular detection process. This allows new definitions of zero and a solution to the problem of nothing. Consider that a monocular detection process asks the question, is there a single exclusive thing present in my input? If the answer is yes, an output is generated and perception occurs. If the answer is no, no output is generated and perception does not occur. The answer no occurs in two fashions, either total absence or presence of two or more simultaneously. For either of these cases, monocular perception gives no output, and perception does not occur, i.e., the absence of perception occurs. Now, note that the monocular perception cannot tell any difference in the two input conditions. To it, there is no distinction between the two conditions. The lack of any difference at all constitutes identity. Thus, to a monocular perception process, condition 1 is identical to condition 2 when they are enfolded together in condition 3. So, total absence and multiple unseparated presence are identical insofar as a monocular detection process is concerned. Einstein's postulates of special relativity conclude that every photon is moving at the same speed relative to every particle in the laboratory frame of reference. The laboratory frame is the static reference frame of the observer measurement, but higher dimensions, unobservable, may be enfolded in hyperspace and orthogonally rotated 90 degrees to the laboratory frame. The cube of space, diamond body, and vector equilibrium matrix are such hyperdimensional frames of reference. They allow us to conceptualize and engineer such realms. A frame of reference is a spatial, organized, measured lattice placed in emptiness, in space-time. Normally, this refers to a three-dimensional spatial frame. All objects and points in the universe or spatial frame are considered to simultaneously coexist at separate measured points in the frame. It differs from the vacuum in that vacuum has no existing definite lengths, vectors, and no existing definite time intervals, scalars. These appear only after measurements, detection, and are relative to the observer and to the detection process. A separate reference frame may be assumed to exist for any fixed or moving object or entered on any point in another frame. When a type of frame is assumed, The entire class of physical interactions that can occur has been restricted to an assumed set or type. In other words, given the frame, the physics have been assumed. One of the greatest restrictions of an assumed frame is to rule out the consideration, the existence, of other higher dimensions. In the new theory, higher dimensions are permitted and an orthogonally rotated frame can be equated to a field and vice versa. Hyperdimension, hyperspace, hyperframe, hyperworld, and hyperfield are all synonymous terms. Any kind of field can be turned into any other kind of field merely by correct and precise time synchronization. Mass is determined by the resistance an object poses to an accelerating or disturbing force. Mass is also tied to three-dimensional objects. A photon moving at the speed of light can neither be speeded up nor slowed down. Hence, in one sense, it exhibits infinite mass, but it loses a dimension when it intersects the laboratory frame. Due to orthogonality, it appears two-dimensional with zero mass. This is because at the boundary, opposites are identified. At the orthogonal boundary of 3 space, zero mass and infinite mass become identical, so the photon exhibits both zero mass and infinite mass simultaneously when it crosses the threshold of the mass exhibiting world. The diamond body and the vector equilibrium matrix are manifolds of enfolded information. The relationship between mind and matter is not mutually exclusive. The vector equilibrium matrix is a means of engineering the transition from virtual to physical space, from concept to reality. Mind and matter are either partially or totally one and the same thing. They are of exactly the same nature, but only partially intersecting. Mind is an entire physical world, but it only minutely intersects this physical frame, and then only in a portion of this physical plane. The single dimension parameter generates the second, third, fourth, fifth, and up to the nth dimensions of the manifold by repetitive operations on itself. Primitive perception. The primitive observer or natural man is conditioned to perceive objects and relations between objects. This is the basis of logic, mathematics, and physics. Set theory is simply the synthesized and abstracted game of elementary perception of the macroscopic world. This is why mathematics can be used to perceive physical phenomena. The macroscopic intuitive perception is the basis of our concept of objectivity and our physical concepts of observed and observable. What we see as an object has interacted with photons of light through absorption and emission. Light itself is only detectable in its interaction with matter. The concepts of object, mass, 3 dimensions, and observation are directly correlated to the photon-mass interaction, and ultimately to the photon-electron interaction occurring in the human retina. The ideas of boundary, surface, and change in primitive perception thus involve 2 contradictory and simultaneously mixed interactions, absorption and emission. Because they are constantly intermingled, primitive perception cannot separate the 2, absorption and emission. Thus, the primitive concept of a boundary consists of a simultaneous duality. Here the object both begins and ends. Here opposites are identified. The dimensionality and orthogonality, spatially, of the primitive perception process are also interesting. Photon absorption constitutes spatial integration for the photon. One additional dimension is gained by the 2-dimensional light wave turning itself into the 3-dimensional mass state. The photon also adds its piece of time to the absorbing mass, converting the mass particle to mass time or space-time, adding the 4th dimension. Photon emission constitutes spatial differentiation, dimensionally speaking. One spatial dimension is lost by a little hunk of 3-dimensional mass turning itself into a 2-dimensional wave. Going from outside the object toward the inside to track with photon absorption, the boundary marks the end of the 2-dimensional wave region. So the object, or more precisely the interaction region, is spatially 2-dimensional on the outside and spatially 3-dimensional on the inside. So is the vector equilibrium matrix in the tree of life. It also occupies the time dimension on the inside, but not the outside. Ditto. This directly accounts for a difference in the spacetime inside and spacetime outside, and is why mass may be regarded as a curvature or change in spacetime. Going from inside the object toward the outside, the boundary marks the end of the spatially three-dimensional region and the beginning of the spatially two-dimensional region. So the object is now spatially three-dimensional on the inside, spatially two-dimensional on the outside. The inside now does not occupy the time dimension, while the photon emitted outside does. So on the boundary, one spatial dimension is gained going in, and one spatial dimension is lost going out. Time is gained going in and lost going out by the mass absorber emitter. Gain or loss of a dimension is accomplished only by orthogonal rotation between 90-degree nested spatial frames. The photon interaction may be modeled as ortho-rotation of an entity spatially in a 5 space. Einstein showed that velocity can be regarded simply as the measure of rotation of an entity in a higher dimensional space. Since light is orthogonal to the entire space, the speed of light is the same to every observer in that space. Velocity also represents a statement of the switching of time into length and length into time. It is therefore a rotation of a spatial three-dimensional frame. The photon interaction process is monocular. Each photon must attack matter individually and live or die in the process. Each photon born from matter is also born independently. Thus, the primitive observation process is monocular, since it is totally in one-to-one correspondence with photon interaction that is monocular. Thus, the observed world is monocular, quantized, discretized. This is why quantum mechanics seems so irrational and counterintuitive. It is difficult to comprehend that which cannot be verified by our senses and experience, but macroscopic observable causality may be violated by control of hidden subquantal virtual state variables. Everett's theory of the universal wave function incorporates multiple simultaneous observation and hence direct insight beyond the limitations of the monocular correspondence to the photon interaction. Photon interaction must be excluded whenever the so-called quantum effect is exhibited. If photon interaction is invoked, classical reality emerges. Photon interaction creates classical objectivity. Photon interaction is a time differentiating operator imposed on 4 space. Since light carries time, photon emission from an entity strips away the time dimension, converting it into a spatial object. The time portion of an entity can interact with any number of time portions of other 4-law entities if the time aspects of all of them coincide. To the laboratory observer, ortho-rotation constitutes pure dimensional integration and dimensional differentiation, and constitutes or creates an object in the first place as 3-dimensional reality. Outside this primitive process, all exists in the omega nothingness void, without frame or form. Ultimate reality, specifically action, is dimensionless in the objective sense, for the objective sense exists only after an operation has been imposed. A quantum itself is lengthless and has no exclusive energy, time, or momentum until differentiation is imposed upon it. Fission and fusion of action quanta involve orthogonal rotation between orthogonal 3 spaces sharing the same 4th dimension, time, in common. When a quantum is observed as manifest, it exhibits changes in length, time, energy, mass, and momentum. It can be modeled as a vector. A vector is a mathematical entity which can be characterized by a magnitude and direction. They are formed by a difference in potential between 2 spatial points. Thus, inductance and capacitance are merely electromagnetic vector statements of amounts of rotation, one in a positive direction and the other in a negative direction, toward an orthogonal axis in higher dimensional space. Vectors are characteristic of particle motion and do not observably exist in the absence of a particle. In the vacuum, only an unzipped, disintegrated vector pattern exists. Only the potential for a force vector exists there. The vector field is the assigning of a magnitude and direction vector to each point in space. reference the isotropic vector matrix. The entire set of vectors and their spatial points is called a vector field. In Bearden's approach, such a vector field cannot observably exist in a vacuum, since only disintegrated things exist there. There, each potential vector patterns exist broken into virtual bits, ordered in line to form the bits of the observable vector, but not joined. In the presence of a detecting integrating mass, such a spinning charged electron, the virtual bits and the spinning charged mass couple into a system that identically comprises the observable factor. In other words, the spin of an observable particle simply integrates the ordered virtual bit pattern, just as an old spinning wheel twists and integrates individual fibers into a stranded thread or rope. Virtual, hidden, or occult entities. All fundamental particles, photons, neutrons, protons, electrons, etc., exhibit the same behavior. So things, nothings if you will, can be processed in the multiplistic two states identified as one, so no single exclusive state, paradox boundary threshold, as virtual and unobserved entities. From ordinary objective lap space, nothing is processed, and indeed nothing is there, because these virtual hidden variable nothings are unobservable. Yet, this processable, structurable, non-objective reality exists outside objective 3-law spacetime and is the basis for all cyclotronic phenomena. To our present monocular detection devices and monocular theory, such multiple state entities are unobserved and hence are zeros. They are pure vacuum, pure space, pure nothing, pure emptiness, but they are very real indeed, and they do physically exist, but multiocularly rather than monocularly. The virtual state is that part of physical reality consisting of changes, particles, waves, and other entities, smaller than the least detectable quantum change. Disintegrated changes. A thought or thought form is also virtual. Virtual entities may be visualized as consisting of real, dynamic pieces of vacuum or pieces of nothing called quitons by Bearden. Every ordinary observable particle, photon, neutron, electron, proton, etc., contains or consists of a dynamically changing cloud of virtual objects. Exchange of virtual objects is thought to generate almost all forces of nature. Conservation of energy need not be conserved in virtual interactions, and generally is not. In the new approach, the mind may be considered a special virtual universe, and a thought a virtual object. The virtual state consists of multiply nested levels, each level progressively finer and more subtle. These sub-levels also correspond mathematically to higher geometrical dimensions. Virtual particles in the vacuum flux arise out of nothing spontaneously, creation, and disappear into nothing spontaneously, annihilation. Since this is random, at any instant, any sort of pattern imaginable is just appearing and just disappearing in the vacuum. Thus, a ghost pattern of everything exists in the vacuum at any point or region at any time. The vacuum is thus a giant virtual state hologram. Integrating, kindling, one of these forms will result in it becoming first a neutrinic pattern, then a photonic light pattern, then a materializing pattern, and finally a material pattern. Discharge of the potential of this pattern then reverses the process. These two processes, charge up and discharge, constitute materialization and dematerialization. Anything at all, living or dead, can be materialized or dematerialized. Whoa. The vacuum as scalar field is also the rigorous identity of a massless charged field of, for example, the electrostatic scalar potential, 0. Also, the scalar field is considered to be composed of two time fields, one in positive time and one in negative time. That is the phase conjugate replica of the first. Thus, the timeless, lengthless vacuum exists both in positive and negative time, and its potentials are scalar potentials. When the vacuum is uncurved, equal amounts and components of positive and negative time exist. When it is curved at a point, the positive and negative time components are unbalanced at that point. Virtual hyperspace. Zero is a relative term, relative to an observer. An observer who perceives nothing, registers nothing, but subtle reality can be quite different. An observer sees his own frame and intersections in that frame, nothing else. He does not necessarily see the entire reality of any object, and if an object is in a frame that does not intersect the observer's frame, the observer cannot detect that object at all. Photons behave like massless particles. A photon has zero mass because it is a two-dimensional object and only three-dimensional objects have mass. A photon also has an infinite mass because it cannot be accelerated along its direction of travel, i.e., go faster than the speed of light. A photon is a perfectly ordinary three-dimensional particle existing in a normal 3 space that is one orthogonal turn away from the laboratory 3 space. Localized mass is merely the result of ortho-rotational flux in and out of that localized space. This flux does not move through laboratory 3 space, but rotates into it and out of it, at and for each fundamental particle of mass in real-time 3 space. This hyperspatial flux is actually flowing or rotating in hyperspace. This is where the ordinary spin of fundamental particle comes in. Hyperspace flux lines are jittered because the modulations made by higher frequency components, the jitterbugging as Fuller calls it, relates to paranormal phenomena. We can look at hyperspace flux from a point of view of matter or mind. Materially, it is a continual, direct, coherent collection of virtual subquanta to reach the quantum threshold, reach it, and become observable quantum change. Virtual photons kindle and create electric fields and the charge of an electrically charged particle. From the point of view of our consciousness, hyperspace flux is a continual, direct, coherent collection of the mind virtual state subquanta to reach the quantum threshold, reach it, and turn into observable quantum change, physical phenomena. Thus, all matter is totally mind and alive. Inert matter is just non-preferentially alive. The resultant flux vector in an inert mass is zero, since there exists as much flow out as in, and vice versa. Thus, we eliminate the classical dichotomy between mind and matter. Channels of least resistance exist to translate from one dimension to the other. It is easiest to establish them through the paths of least resistance, the magic frequency windows. Magic window induction works like a transducer. Modulation of the primary flux happens through jitter or dither, and the continual virtual subquantum ortho-rotational flux crosstalk rotating into and out of a fundamental mass particle. Only the components that are coherent are additive. Only those that add to the quantum threshold and breach it become observable quantum change. This is the threshold where it is possible for virtual minds to affect virtual matter in real time. It is the basis of all magic, sympathetic response, synchronicity, invocation, visualization, correspondence. The translation comes through the process of the kindling of response in the primary medium of expression, the virtual state entities. So be careful what you imagine, visualize, or even think of yourself. Because we can physically confirm that thoughts become things. Our self-image is perhaps one of our most important creations. Our early experience of the environment conditions this image greatly. It imprints fundamentals such as whether the world is a safe place to be or not. Trauma locks up energies in the body, and the self-image can become frozen and inhibit growth of the personality, especially in its expression of one's higher self or holy guardian angel. This image can be destructed or liquefied, solutio, eliminating the old holographic pattern and returning all elements to a chaotic state. From this chaos, the new image automatically emerges in regenerated form. This death rebirth is commonly referred to as healing and may be the mechanism of the placebo effect. Self-image is locked up in identification with a multisensory image of self. It conditions the body and its state of health. The process of detachment from one's body, emotions, thoughts, and even the notion of self is a way of disidentifying with the the old outworn model and creating a non-localized impression of oneself as contiguous with the universal consciousness. The self-simulation, Tart, 1990, carries consciousness from moment to moment, even though that self fluctuates through a variety of states and conditions. These are internally generated virtual realities, according to Altered States of Consciousness expert Charles Tart. He postulates a mechanism for self-simulation and world simulation by boldly declaring that we all live inside a world simulation machine. The magical body or body of light or diamond body can be used for identification purposes for consciousness journeys to realms which supersede physical manifestation. The diamond body or vector equilibrium matrix function simultaneously as vehicles of consciousness and psychotronic energy accumulators. They focus intent and will, much like a crystal can focus light. They focus intent and will, much like a crystal can focus light. The proactive approach is learn, commit, do. Time is produced by the fission of the quantum of action. All remaining statistical subquanta which have not collected to the threshold level are virtual subquanta of action possession unfissioned, unseparated time. Each and every piece of time contains dynamic, nested virtual subquanta. Time in observable changes may thus be said to possess an internal dynamic structure filled with such virtual subquanta mental, neutrino, and photonic entities. Mind becomes matter. It matters when virtual mental entities cohere frequency-wise until they breach the quantum threshold and discharge into observable quantum change. It is much like the accumulation of a static charge until sufficient potential is reached and a spark occurs, discharging the accumulation of charge. The same relationship exists between virtual mental state and observable state. The only difference is that virtual mental state accumulates by frequency or time phase. Perhaps you can draw your own conclusions about what this might mean concerning magical timing and tides, as well as regularity in practice. If you are going to charge your magical machine, your altar, which is the temple of yourself, the temple of self-amplification, there are protocols for maximizing the charge. This is also the basis of the magical egregore and group ritual. The many minds model has always contended that the force of the concurrent magical visualization and effort is cumulative and exponential. At the quantum level, a physical change is totally statistical to a monocular observer, but this is not so when many minds are involved. It is why the quantum world is statistical rather than casual. The mind-matter interface is not a causal model. Your mind doesn't cause matter to change per se. The virtual entities you fantasize manipulating are mind or consciousness themselves, stuff that is not different from matter or yourself in its deepest essence. We can regard a fundamental particle as simply a complicated three-space tuning pattern existing in the ortho-rotational crosstalk flux between ortho frames. Our bodies are composed of nothing more than that. Thus, we are vibrations, just as the ancient Indians, Theosophists, psychedelic movement, and psychics reveal. Thus, each fundamental particle is a set of tuning frequencies in the flux. A stable particle is a stable spectrum comprised of standing waves, and again, we are that. And yet the fabric of our being constantly comes and goes. We shed skin cells and rotate our whole innards every 7 years. Our atoms are continually being created, destroyed, or exchanged with the environment. Unstable particles are unstable sets, comprised of some standing waves, which account for the duration, and some not quite standing waves, which account for the excited state or degree of instability of the object. Particles can be destabilized by such subliminal thoughts as, "I am a bad person and deserve punishment." Core issues like this can lead to thought patterns which destabilize systems in the body and lead to a diversity of diseases, ranging from those described as psychosomatic to those which pronounce a death sentence, such as cancer. Every fundamental particle is a tuning. We know this fundamentally when we speak metaphorically of being in and out of tune with our real-time life situation. Paradoxically, the flux tunes and is the result of its tuning. Scalar electromagnetics and the Plenum. Current speculation about the nature of subquantum reality bears on the philosophical nature of the vacuum, the void, and the persistent notion of a fundamental ether. Our approach is that of an alchemist who would unite psyche and matter. The quantum cosmology suggested by scalar electromagnetics finds mythic resonance in Aleister Crowley's resurrection of the Egyptian deity, Nuit and Hadith, in the Book of the Law. Nuit is infinite space, that which is not, the continuous one, the void, infinite potential, the plenum. Hadith is any point which has experience of these possibilities. Crowley also characterized it as motion. Their interaction represents the relationship of the whole to the seemingly discrete. Nature has no absolute laws, and nothing is absolutely prohibited a priori. At the microscopic level, there is no such thing as a fixed or static anything. Everything is in incessant motion. What we see macroscopically as a fixed object is actually composed of very small parts that are always in violent motion. Macroscopically static force actually consists of a myriad of microvectors, each moving and doing work against resistance. The macrostatic force is composed of micro work. Any vector can be replaced by two scalar fields. The interference of two scalar electromagnetic potentials constitutes a vector electromagnetic field. Any vector electromagnetic wave can be replaced by two scalar electromagnetic waves. Waves of potentials, electrostatic and magnetostatic, exist in vacuum, and the coupling of a spinning charged particle to these potential waves constitutes the force field waves actually detected and measured by our instruments. Scalar electromagnetic view of the vacuum. The vacuum, and spacetime, can now be considered to be made of photon-structured gravitons and supergravitons. In other words, the graviton can be regarded as a piece of the vacuum spacetime medium. Gravitation is simply enfolded and trapped electromagnetic energy, and electromagnetic energy is simply the outfolded contents of gravitational energy. Gravitational potential is locked up electromagnetic field, while an electromagnetic field is unlocked gravitational potential. Vectorially speaking, and roughly put, gravity is operationally zeroed or trapped electromagnetics, and electromagnetics is operationally broken out or bled off gravity. In the modern quantum mechanical view, the vacuum is not an emptiness, but instead is a plenum or fullness. Puthoff, 1989. Today, the vacuum is considered to be filled with incredible virtual particle activity. From nowhere, virtual particles continually rise, even with fierce energy, then disappear into nowhere, so rapidly that they cannot be individually observed. However, these virtual particles are quite real, for they cause all the forces of nature when they interact and they aggregate with observable particles. Thus, the vacuum is viewed as a seething inferno of virtual particle fluxes, and the concept of an ether is again accepted as referring to this virtual plasma or virtual flux vacuum, which is a far different ether than the old material ether that was theorized prior to relativity. Continually, every type of particle imaginable spontaneously arises, creation, and disappears, annihilation, at every point in the vacuum, according to modern quantum mechanics. The rate of this virtual particle creation and annihilation in the vacuum is essentially unlimited. Further, any virtual particle created has a flux of even finer particles associated with it, and each of those has yet a finer flux associated, and so on without limit. The vacuum's virtual particle flux is thus comprised of nested levels of ever finer virtual particle fluxes in the modern view. Each deeper virtual level may be modeled as a higher dimension, hyperdimension, to yield an infinite dimensional vacuum spacetime, hyperspace, that is identically the infinite nested levels of virtual state. At the same time, every nucleus in the universe is continually absorbing and emitting scalar electromagnetic, electrogravitational waves. And these waves of pure potential are waves in the stress and structuring of the vacuum itself. Hence, at every point in the vacuum, an intense flux of these scalar electromagnetic waves with concomitant interferences exists and casually drives, constitutes, all the enormous quivering of the vacuum space-time medium itself. To the observer, from a purely statistical standpoint, in this violent vacuum flux, any and every finite patterning of particles is also continually being momentarily created and destroyed, and at every level and in every hyperdimension. Thus, in the vacuum, there continually exists at any and every point and in any and every region the ghostly image of anything and everything, whether in the past, present, or future, and whether potential, probabilistic, or actual. Rigorously, the universal vacuum may be taken to be sort of a giant hologram, for the whole is in each part, albeit in ghost-like manner. Everything that is, or was, or shall be, and everything that could be, but isn't, wasn't, or shan't be, already exists at once, anywhere and everywhere, in this ghostly holographic virtual state. This image of reality is directly implied by quantum mechanics. It is not metaphysics. There has been a problem of missing chaos in quantum mechanic theory. Scalar waves seem to be the missing ingredient. The hidden order in the vacuum fluctuations shows them as chaotic instead of random, though still statistical. Chaos theory describes nonlinear dynamic systems, far from equilibrium. Chaos displays certain qualities, all of which apply to scalar wave theory: nonlinear, dynamic, deterministic, far from equilibrium, disintegrated, nigentropic systems of potential energy. We can further examine the flux of one type of virtual particle through a point, hadid, in the vacuum, Nuit. Virtual particle flux creates a charge at that point. Various kinds of fluxes constitute various kinds of change and compromise various kinds of potentials. One type of change may always be decomposed, disintegrated, into other kinds of charge, as can potentials. The magnitude of the electrostatic scalar potential at a point in vacuum represents the magnitude of the flux of virtual photons through the point, hence the electrical charge at the point. The vacuum is filled with and consists of many types of potentials. The overall vacuum potential remains the same from point to point, though individual potentials may vary. We can view the vacuum ether space-time as a special sort of gas, where the gas is actually a mixture of many gases. This particular gas exists in 5 or more dimensions and is composed of very strange, fleeting particles which spontaneously are created and destroyed, each arising out of nowhere and returning to nowhere almost immediately. There is only minuscule, negligible time overlap, integration, of the existence of these virtual particles in the main. Mostly, each vertical particle, along with its associated energy, movement, momentum, charge, and increment of time, exists almost entirely as an individual. Thus, the energies, movements, momenta, charges, and time increments of the individual virtual particles do not integrate or sum to any appreciable degree. These are densities of disintegrated energy, momentum, and time flow. In scalar electromagnetics, the disintegrated energy of vacuum is termed anenergy, A-N-E-N-E-R-G-Y. Virtual energy is disintegrated. Observable energy is integrated. The integrating agent is usually the spin of an observable particle of mass. The vacuum contains enormous anenergy, but essentially no energy. The energy density of vacuum, stress energy density, and vacuum energy are misnomers. The Russians describe it as the information content of the field, but not in the sense of normal communication theory. Maybe we should call it the uniformation content. The realm of the vacuum is pre-geometric. It has been described as vector zero summation, and described extensively by R. Buckminster Fuller in Synergistics 1 and 2. But vector descriptions are wholly inadequate to describe something that is more fundamental than vectors. Fuller spoke of the vector equilibrium matrix because that was the most sophisticated language available then. He noted the weird mathematical anomaly at the center of the figure where normal space-time breaks down. But there are shortcomings in vector analysis. The concept of vector has both direction and magnitude, but a scalar only has magnitude since it does not exist in the 3 space of Cartesian coordinates. Vector space is abstractly defined as a space which can contain objects called vectors. Fuller called the system the isotropic vector matrix, an omnidirectional grid of tetrahedra filling all space. If scalars have any relationship to vectors, it is that they are perhaps the essence of disintegrated vectors, chaos. Zero vector is an entity defined in vector analysis by a set of operations. It is simply the absence of any vector of finite magnitude. By implication, in abstract vector theory, all zero vectors are defined as identical. But this doesn't include the influence of the real, though intangible, stress gradient in the vacuum. In the abstract mathematical model, vector space has no such thing as stress, and a zero vector has no structure. That is why vector equilibrium is a system, not a structure. Its anomalous center is a chaotic disassembled system. The presence of summing vector component forces creates a stress of macroscopic structure in the physical medium, in and on which the forces are acting. Even in a vacuum, the stress of the medium and its structure must be preserved and accounted for as charge and energy conversion between one kind of charge potential and another. Separation of vacuum and observable states. Because the energy density of vacuum is unintegrated, an integrated physical body, including one's own personal body, can exist in the vacuum medium of incredible energy density, yet observably exists in a medium of zero energy density. The unintegrated vacuum either has enormous spatial density of virtual energy, but essentially has zero spatial density of observable energy. In the hyperdimensional interpretation of the levels of virtual state, the vacuum spatially does not exist in the normal 3 space of observable matter. The vacuum occupies the 4th dimension, time, and all spatial dimensions, hyperdimensions, greater than the 3rd. It occupies all levels of virtual state, but not observable state. Exchanges occur between normal 3 space and hyperspatial vacuum through the common connecting dimension, time. Exchanges of virtual particles are integrated by the spinning observable particle into the first quantally excited state, collapse of the wave function, the production of unitary quantum change, and the discretizing of observable change. Time is the only dimension where everything, Nuit, can be considered to occupy the same point, hadith, or interval, but it is discretized and chopped into pieces, quite different in nature from the familiar 3 spatial dimensions of the observable universe. The dimensional separation, spatially, of the seething vacuum energy, and the 3 space of normal matter allows the physical body to interact with the vacuum, chaos, at or near equilibrium at the microscopic level, but maintain its macroscopic form and stability. Vacuum spacetime consists entirely of potentials, nothing else, and these are hyperspatial a priori. The vacuum does not contain force fields per se, nor any other non-potential entity. No vector force exists in vacuum. Force is an effect, not a cause. A differentiating operator must be applied to, coupled to, a potential in order to produce a force field. The most usual is an observable spinning charged particle which couples to the stream of virtual photons. Its spin integrates the unobservable disintegrated energy of the gradient flux into integrated observable energy of the particle. This translates into the observable electric field, which is only a potential in a vacuum. If potential exists as an unintegrated virtual particle flux, VPF, it can be zipped or unzipped as force. The electrostatic scalar potential is composed of a myriad of little individual virtual particle electric force field vectors, the smear of the virtual particle moving over time. When these little virtual vectors are essentially separate and unintegrated, the electric field is unzipped in vacuum. The E-field vectors are unintegrated. A potential is always an unzipped vector field of unintegrated virtual vectors. The spin of an observable charged particle zips or integrates in energy. The spin of the observable particle acts as the zipper. Vacuum is unzipped. Observable mass is zipped. Any zipped entity exists observably in 3-space. Any unzipped entity exists in hyperspace and is unobservable and virtual to the 3-space observer. The interpretation is still consistent with the quantum mechanical view, where ultimately all observable forces are considered to be generated by absorption and emission of virtual particles by or from an observable particle mass. So force becomes an effect, not a cause. The primary causative agents are potentials, not force fields, as is now firmly established in quantum mechanics. Zero-summed electromagnetic force vector systems stress the vacuum. A pattern system of oppositive forces forms a stress in the vacuum medium. It is the alchemical holding the tension of the opposites. The stress is oscillation. This oscillation, which we call a scalar electromagnetic wave, is a gravitational wave, since the local curvature of space-time is being oscillated. This internal stress in the medium has several characteristics which identify it as a chaotic in essential nature. 1. It has deterministic pattern or substructure. 2. It patterns or polarizes the vacuum. 3. It constitutes local curvature of spacetime. 4. It deterministically engineers the virtual state and local spacetime. 5. It affects the Schrödinger wave and the probabilities of the states propagated forward, leading to the possibility of engineering the emergence of quantum change. 6. The scalar wave can accomplish direct and localized change of the rate of flow of time, even to its reversal, and variation of mass and inertia without translation of matter. 7. Since excess negative time flow may be locally produced, negentropy may be locally produced. When the vectorally zeroing components are dynamic, the scalar resultant is dynamic. The dynamic scalar term is the scalar electromagnetic wave. Engineering the vacuum. A vectorially zeroed electromagnetic system, vector equilibrium matrix, stresses and deterministically structures local spacetime. It changes the energy density of the local vacuum and curves local spacetime. Spacetime curvature must be of such direction that a local energy source exists. This curvature affects the local flow of time. Negentropy is a direct result of a local curvature of spacetime. The locally trapped energy constitutes a potential. The vectorially zeroed electromagnetic system, which has trapped its dynamic energy inside a local area, creates and constitutes an artificial potential in the local vacuum. This potential means dynamically structuring the vacuum, the virtual state, through hidden variable theory. With this technology, we can directly engineer quantum change, skew or change the probabilities propagated by the Schrödinger wave, and engineer the atomic nucleus directly with minuscule power. One simply oscillates each component of the zeroing structure in common phase, always maintaining the overall zero electromagnetic vector resultant as a scalar wave or gravitational wave. Scalar electromagnetic theory makes it possible to model the mind and its relationship to physical reality. It is the mechanism allowing mind to affect matter, for example, in healing. Mind consists of electromagnetic fields. Passage of an electromagnetic wave through the vacuum leaves an invisible trace. The vacuum imprints everything that happens in it. The imprint is electrogravitational, i.e., the imprinting process structures the substructure of vacuum spacetime, the artificial potential of vacuum. The vacuum ether spacetime is composed of gravitons. This means that the mind, memory, personality are centered in dynamic photon structures inside structured gravitons, which in turn comprise artificial potentials that are centered in the atomic nuclei of the matter in the body. In the late 1960s, Lysistin reported that the Soviets had broken the genetic code of the human brain. He stated the code had 44 digits or less, and the brain employed 22 frequency bands across nearly the whole electromagnetic spectrum. Note the 22 paths of the tree of light, 22 tarot trumps, 22 primary archetypal modes of information transfer and feedback. However, only 11 of the frequency bands were independent. 11 is the key to all rituals. This work implies that if 11 or more correct frequency channels can be phase-locked into the human brain, then it should be possible to drastically influence the thoughts, vision, physical functioning, emotion, and conscious state of the individual, even from a great distance. The human brain and nervous system use highly complex substructuring of gravitons and supergravitons rather than photons to perform mind functions. Thought and personality are directly explainable in terms of scalar electromagnetics. Chemistry is based totally on charge and charge distribution. If you control charge and charge distribution in the body, you can control all the biochemistry of the body with minuscule voltages and currents. Engineering the vacuum may lead to true transformation of the elements. If two weak monochromatic electromagnetic waves are run together 180 degrees out of phase and run through a non-linear medium so that they modulate each other and lock together, they make a strange scalar electromagnetic wave. That is, an electrogravitational wave of pure potential, and one that you are controlling. Such a wave goes down through the electron shells of the atoms and is absorbed in the nucleus. If you choose the right mix of waves in the scalar wave and just keep irradiating the nuclei with that pattern, the nuclei will gradually rearrange themselves. For example, they will be transmuted into another element given the proper signal mix. That is how biological systems transmute elements using millivolts and microwatts of power. Curve-Van effect. The scalar electromagnetic wave passes through the electron shells of the atom, essentially without interaction, entering the nucleus. There it is dephased and absorbed, exciting the nucleus in a particular structured manner. The nuclear potential is increased by assuming the imposed deterministic structure. The nucleus will slowly charge up with the impressed pattern, steadily kindling, linearly integrating, a common virtual pattern, until the observable threshold is breached. An observable change occurs in the nucleus. Depending on the structure imposed on the scalar wave and, in turn, upon the charging nuclear potential, various actions like transmutation can be created directly in the nucleus itself. Mind is objective. A point, hadith, can be considered to be and modeled as a line in a frame one orthogonal turn away, and simultaneously as a plane two orthogonal turns away, and simultaneously as a solid, in fact an entire three-dimensional physical world, three orthogonal rotations away. The latter may also be considered to be and modeled as a mind, or even as an enfolded set of minds. The concept does not stop at 3 dimensions, but proceeds into higher realms indefinitely. However, 3 dimensions plus an orthogonal time dimension are sufficient for our purposes. Time is mind. In time differentiating, mass loses the time dimension. Therefore, we cannot see time with a mass perceiver, but we can see spatial extension, Cartesian coordinates, Lorentz frame, cube of space. But time is the only so-called objective dimension occupied or shared by mind. Therefore, we also cannot normally perceive the mind because the dimension time is lost in the perception process. Time does not exist except with respect between one spatial extension perception and another, if the only output signal is the 3 space of natural perception. Physical time is totally relative, totally mental, and exists only in memory. Mind is thus present in 4-dimensional physical phenomena and is discretized along with time discreteness in the Heisenberg uncertainty relation. Mind creates time by establishing the comparing 3-space realities. The only place the former perception of 3-space can rigorously be found is in memory. An event, once occurred, is in the past and is forever gone to the observer. Only in his memory can it be said to exist. But then, so is the observation also of the most recent event. Thus, rigorously observed phenomena may be said to exist only in memory, and there is only a past, never a present. Thus, a full 4-dimensional mind is inseparable from perceived physical phenomena, and mind is quantized along with quantum change in the physical world. On the boundary interface, such as skin, a type of field may be turned into another. The cyclotronic field, biofield may be turned into an electromagnetic field, and vice versa. The boundary interface serves as a transfer function mechanism for translating one kind of effect into another. Both ends of the transfer functions are excitonically united and on the interface. For example, coherence of cyclic rhythms like breath and heartbeat during psychokinesis. Man, Earth, and cosmos are psychotronically and coherently linked. The boundary of an object is a transducer coupling internal and external dynamic changes in one-to-one correspondence. The transducer effect applies to both living and non-living systems. Through tuning and resonance, internal patterns can be incepted externally, and external patterns can be incepted internally. For more on resonance effects in consciousness, see Stalking the Wild Pendulum. Itzhak Bentov, E.P. Dutton, New York, 1977. Local curvature of space-time means a thing in one frame can be something quite different in another frame, in respect to the observer's static frame. What a thing is totally relative to the perceiver and his perceiving frame. It can even be nothing in a great many frames. This is how nothing, Nuit, can contain everything, Hadit. So we really can turn nothing into something if we're clever. We can tap zero-point energy psychotronically, mentally, and physically. We have a scheme of multiple worlds and multiple realities from which we may construct living systems, thoughts, tulpas, etc., and we may also turn one type of field into another simply by virtual state collection or separation, as the case may be. Some frames are mental or virtual, yet they are all just as real as three-space entities. In this system, mind is modeled in terms of physics, and physical reality is modeled in terms of mind. The only difference between any two entities in the various worlds is a matter of orthogonal rotation. Everything is a thought in at least one frame. Each entity is a photon in at least one frame. Let there be light. By orthogonal 90-degree rotation, a thing can change its face with respect to an observer, appearing to change into a totally different sort of thing with respect to a fixed object in one frame. Reality is quite plastic and absolutely unlimited. Materialization of an object by three receding orthogonal rotations exist. In such a case, the dematerialized object appears the same as a thought object or virtual object. A perfectly valid mechanism thus exists for tulpoids, materialized thought forms, UFO, Bigfoot, etc. All that is needed is a sufficient virtual state collection mechanism, such as a vector equilibrium matrix. An object may be kindled from a remote frame to one that is less remote. Two successive applications of kindling turns thought into electromagnetic field. Three kindlings turns a thought object into a materialized object, a tulpoid, a Tibetan Buddhism term. Biofields and tulpoids. Such a materialized thought object may be of an inert object or of a living, breathing, biological being. The model we are working in has eliminated any superficial difference between the living and non-living because it is a four-law model. A materialized living being will be just as real and physical and functional as any other person of this earth. Ultimately, that is all that we are ourselves, tulpoids. Nothing exists but the thought of the infinite creator, and we are simply part of that thought. The coherence in multiple stages necessary to accomplish kindling is often referred to as tuning in this book. Tuning sufficient to enable two orthogonal rotations results in thought turning into electromagnetic field or light. Such a kindled field may be additive or subtractive to existing electromagnetic fields. Thus, kindling can cancel an electromagnetic field that already exists, or it can create one where none previously existed, or it can shape, modulate, or change one which already exists. Kindling can also wipe out the charge on a charged particle, or it can build up a charge on an object which previously had no electric charge. Any changing entity in any frame crosstalks a tiny amount into any other frame, but it may also be so small as to be virtual, hence unobservable. Coherent virtual crosstalk integrates and can reach the threshold between virtual and observable state. Another point to notice is that most fundamental particles in a frame rarely move with constant velocity. Instead, they normally accelerate and decelerate continually. Thus, the actual velocity vector of one of these entities is continually changing, usually quite erratically, chaotic. But for microscopic particles in regular atomic or crystalline formations, the change pattern is quite regular. Reference the diamond body. The constant changes on the velocity induce a jitter component on its crosstalk into other bioframes. See Fuller on jitterbug transformation of vector equilibrium matrix and octahedron. So the crosstalk into a frame is jittery. Thus, a fundamental particle is jittery or wave-like. The fine structure constant of an electron encompasses this hyperspatial jitter or wave-like state of the electron. The fine structure constant is about 1 in 137th. Thus, an electron actually spends about 1 in 137th of the time in hyperspace. Because of jitter, an object is partially in every hyperframe a minute, but finite part. Because of jitter, an object is partially in every hyperframe a minute but finite part of the time. So are all minds and mental objects, and so are all virtual objects. The identity coefficient shows how much the fundamental particle pervades another frame. For an electron to orbit in an atom, or for any other electron for that matter, there is a small but finite probability that the electron may be at any given position in the universe when its detection occurs. In other words, there is a finite probability of collecting an electron at any point in the universe, Nuit. And the collection may be made from multiple points simultaneously. Spacepoint, mind, and thought are virtually synonymous. Biofields and tulpas, projection as reality. By proper coherent tuning through time synchronization, an object from a maverick world of fantastic possibilities can be ortho-rotated into our own frame and objectified. This is what Tibetan monks call a tulpa, an objective materialization of a thought form. The tulpa will hardly ever be closed entirely in phase, however, and so it will almost always be unstable. UFOs, angels, and imps go away. But the materialization of one of these can be entirely objective, and perfectly objective traces can be left, such as photographs, broken limbs, scorched asphalt, indentations, and depressions in grassy fields. Any thought object can be so ortho-rotated and objectified. Beings, religious figures, angels, fairies, imps, UFOs, and monsters can all appear. At death, the now disembodied mind finds itself in its own deep unconscious world constructs. Reincarnation is simply the resonant coupling which automatically establishes itself in the flux. The disembodied, confused mind will simply be coupled again to a new physical body pattern. This happens at the instant of conception, for the genetic pattern, the complete tuning pattern, is present at that instant. The coupling is quite tenuous at first, and increases in degree as the embryo develops. So, the cycle of rebirth can be broken completely simply by dying with a totally detached mental framework. The cessation of all tuning attachments results in structureless, hence all structured beings, part of universal godness. The major point is that all this can be modeled physically. There is only life. Absence from one place still leaves presence in another. Absence from any and every one place exclusively leaves presence at all places, each non-exclusively. Consciousness, the thread of the relation between consecutive changes and the two respective frames and time are identical. Time is a duration of consciousness. Thus, time and mind are identical. So are time and the universal mind. Consciousness is simply the functioning of coherent crosstalk between a mind frame and a physical body. Each biosystem's consciousness has all other consciousnesses interwoven with it. The entire universe of universes is totally in communication with each part of itself continually, incepting a change from pure causality changes the past. The past is causally inferred or projected backward from the new vectorial direction. Inception, of course, also changes the future slightly. Hidden variable theory, chaos, which causes a radioactive nucleus to decay, is also a mechanism which can directly amplify the virtual mental state into observable state. It is the fundamental mechanism that causes kindling and thus ortho-rotation. It can be used to materialize tulpas, accomplish psychokinesis, clairvoyance, recognition, etc. The effect is based on the concept that a human being must accomplish a minute inception onto his physical system. Specifically, he must incept the movement of 3 or 4 electrons in the brain. This input signal into his physical system amplifies the movement of several electrons into powerful movements of the entire body. Intelligence may be viewed as the ability to adapt behavior, and increased intelligence represents a decrease in the portion of behavioral control that is genetically programmed or hardwired. The common crosstalk in all minds constitutes the collective unconscious. Since the common crosstalk is, in a sense, a mind, and since it is connected to a body of many cells, i.e. 4 billion humans or so, then this collective unconscious is a living, breathing entity. Most of what we term physical reality is prescribed by the collective human unconscious. And if the collective human unconscious is changed in its conception of reality, then 4 billion stages start kindling with the hyperchannel effect, and immediately the new conception is physical reality. Borrowing from Jungian psychology, let us call each form that is in each human mind an archetype. Let us also realize that there are shallower levels of unconsciousness between the total collective unconscious and an individual mind. An archetype that is kindled from the collective unconscious is kindled through such a mechanism of unconscious levels of tuning, and the reality format that is kindled is determined by the type of pressure and the content, biases, or tuning of all the levels between it and the conscious minds of the individuals who observe the phenomena. All tulpoidal manifestations are kindled through this mechanism. All of them are shaped by the multi-level unconscious tuning. All of them are caused by an unresolved conflict in the deeper unconscious layers. Though short-lived because of the unstable tuning, any tulpoidal materialization may be physically real during its stable period. This includes angels, imps, Virgin Marys, UFOs, Sasquatches, Loch Ness monsters, lake monsters, sea monsters, mystery lights, fairies, elves, divas, devils, ogres, men in black, goblins, monster birds, and cattle mutilations. Any infinite number of reality channels exists. The total instrumental characteristics, genetic, psychological, and physiological of the observers who tune in the channel determines the noise content and actual channel selected. A reality is simply an orthogonal frame or world. All possible realities exist. A channel is a set of tuned and timed ortho-rotations communicating back and forth between 2 orthogonal frames or worlds. Tuning is a complex of mind and matter and of many unconscious levels. By time coherence in the virtual state, a virtual entity can be amplified into observable state. From sheer nothing, Nuit, we can produce something, Hadith. And since every possible something exists in nothing and is available for cohering, we can get anything at all by this process, at least hypothetically. Dreams as unresolved conflicts. Everything is essentially mind. Mind forms layer after layer of overlapping zones of shallower and shallower unconsciousness, multiple simultaneous consciousnesses, all the way from the universal allness, Nuit, to the personal unconscious, Rahor Kun. It culminates in each conscious mind. Just as the dreams of an individual show his unresolved conflicts, so the materialized tulpoids of the collective human unconscious shows how its unresolved conflicts. One more time. Just as the dreams of an individual show his unresolved conflicts, So the materialized tolpoids of the collective human unconscious show its unresolved conflicts. At the other end of the spectrum, the human culture seeks and obtains a God form or God image consistent with its own level of understanding and belief. The resulting tolpoidal activity conditioned into the collective unconscious and the cultural unconscious and tuned in from them will be consistent with the cultural desires and expectations. So, in a sense, we are the creators of our own reality and our own tolpoidal expressions of higher reality. But in addition to tolpoids, the present character of space-time and dimensionality and the very laws of the physical universe are largely prescribed by the collective human unconscious. Virtual chaos. Vector equilibrium as zero model, zero phase. Being the zero phase of energy, the vector equilibrium is inherently invisible and non-empirically discoverable, which accounts for its having been for so long unrecognized as the spontaneous equilibrious model. As specialists, scientists seek only the some things. The vector equilibrium is the only model of non-being zero inflection at the no moment of omni-intertransformabilities, where anything can happen and must happen single atomically within and multi-atomically without. Specializing science, seeking only some things, inherently overlooked the non-thing vector equilibrium. Vector equilibria in isotropic vector matrix produce the discontinuity of particles, while the vector weaving around the vector equilibria nucleus produce the continuity of wave phenomena. The vector equilibrium is the most abstract of all the always and only abstract scientific generalizations, for it is the heart of all interrelationships existing between, and not in or of, any of all the empirically apprehended intertransforms of the every and everywhere intertransforming scenario universe. The vector equilibrium is the zero phase, ergo inexpressible, interrelationship of all universe events. The word vacuum relates specifically to gaseous phenomena. Nature's abhorrence of a vacuum induces physical relationships only in respect to the gaseous states. The vector equilibrium is nothingness phase of all states of physical universe. It is the generalization of nothingness, within which generalization the absolute vacuum is a special case event in the gaseous state. The vector equilibrium is such a physically abhorred non-state as to be the eternal self-starter, ergo the eternal re-self-starter, ever regenerating the off-zero perturbations, oscillations, and all the wave propagation of all humanity experienceable physical and metaphysical phenomena. R. Buckminster Fuller, Synergetics 2. Virtual states and hyperspaces. In physics today, there are two separate kinds of reality: observable changes, which can be detected by instruments, and virtual changes, which cannot be detected by instruments, even in theory. Changes smaller than the quantum level are said to be virtual and undetectable, and changes larger than this are said to be observable and detectable. Virtual changes are not bound by the conservation of mass law, and virtual photons can have non-zero mass. Rotation just past the critical angle corresponds to a Lorentz-Fitzgerald contraction into the virtual state below the quantum threshold of the detector's observable universe. But there is a jump effect which happens during the ortho-rotation of light, or acceleration to the speed of light. Mass turns into photons during the final part of ortho-rotation, which is in the virtual state. This is the missing link between relativity and quantum mechanics. Continued rotation into hyperspace passes through successively finer, nested virtual sublevels or sub-thresholds of lab space of the Lorentz-Fitzgerald contraction. The successive breaching of deeper thresholds is due to the continued Lorentz-Fitzgerald contraction. Higher hyperspatial frames constitute nested sublevels in the virtual state with respect to the laboratory observer. Thus, a direct connection exists between virtual levels and hyperspace frames. Hyperspaces and virtual sublevels are the same thing. Every virtual object in lab space is an observable object in some hyperspace. Hyperspatial engineering and virtual state engineering are one and the same thing, and this is why psychotronics and synergetics are all about. For physical observable systems, we can model 6 vectors for every point, hadith. This is the natural geometry of nuclear structural systems. The most economic system is 12 around 1. Closest packed spheres, the intertriangulated geometry of the atomic nucleus. The vector equilibrium is the prime nucleated structural system of the universe. Fuller says, the behavioral in patterning frame of reference of the 6 degrees of freedom in respect to omnidirectionality is of course the vector equilibrium, which embraces the 3-dimensionality of the cube and the 6-dimensionality of the vector equilibrium. Experience is inherently omnidirectional. Ergo, there is always a minimum of 12 others in respect to the nuclear observing self. Because Nuit is the time-space continuum, there must be no thing, much like the void of the purely spatial dimension. Time may be considered as a sort of box containing all observables and virtuals. Indeed, time is neither observable nor virtual. Time is simply a parameter in quantum mechanics. Rigorously, time may be said not to exist. Indian philosophy identifies universal mind with time and calls it Kal, Lord of Karma. Time itself is nothing, totally nothing. Therefore, the fourth law of logic, identity of opposites and boundary paradox, it can be said to be or contain everything, the total mishmash of virtuals and observables. Since, in the absolute sense, there is no such thing as time, then all modeling of space, mind, thing, and no thing must be done spatially. Relativity theory attempts to use time as an existent dimension of the same kind as length, limiting rotation in lab space only in the direction of the time axis in Minkowski geometry spacetime. Spatial modeling requires an infinite dimensional space, Nuit, and an infinite number of orthogonal angles. The time axis that can be drawn in such a hyperspatial model has no meaning except with respect to a relationship existing between 2 or more hyperspace frames or objects. Specifically, the time axis represents the totality of all the hyperspaces and their objects, hence all the relationships that can be separated from the hyperspace. The charge on an electron is due to the continual emission and absorption of virtual photons, little electromagnetic pieces of vacuum, the space-time flux, or little pieces of nothing. The simple movement of the electron is actually composed of a virtual cloud, an infinite number of an infinite number of an infinite number of things, manifold, all happening in a mad tangle of nested substrata in a virtual state. Each of these virtuals with respect to lab space is in fact an observable in some particular hyperspace. Many other sorts of virtual particles are emitted and absorbed and born and extinguished, in addition to photons, by various observable particles in free space. Everything in every possible world or hyperspace is related to each and every other thing in the laboratory world through ortho-rotations and nested virtual states. Crosstalk between hyperframes is the emergence and disappearance of virtual particles in a particular frame. The universe is holographic. If any part of its virtual chaos can be collected and cohered in even the slightest degree, any amount of observable free energy can be obtained. But back to our electron. If we now remove the electron, leaving the empty vacuum, all sorts of virtual madness is still there and occurring. The vacuum is infinitely dense and filled with stupendous zero-point vacuum energy. It is totally chaotic and virtual. Space itself is an infinite tangle of virtuals. Virtual projections from real observables in associated hyperspaces are these dynamic interactives make up any 3-dimensional space and hyperspace itself. They are also what cause space itself to exhibit finite non-zero parameters or values that must be accounted for in our physical equations. Every fundamental constant of nature is dynamically constructed from and due to zero-point virtual vacuum interactions that constitute empty space, Nuit. The virtual sea of seething waves and particles that is empty vacuum is actually an ether, a non-material virtual ether. It is perfectly admissible by the Michelson-Morley experiment and consistent with the entire experimental basis of physics. Einstein once proposed naming the vacuum and its contained fields the ether. his suggestion was not heeded. We now know something quite unusual about an electromagnetic wave and about a photon, because it oscillates with respect to time. The wave moves along the axis of velocity in lab space for a single wavelength, then repeats itself again and again. The oscillation actually represents an orthogonal rotating etheric or hyperspatial flux about the velocity vector. All three vectors of an electromagnetic wave are comprised of nested tangles of virtual subvectors. This spinning, exploding, and imploding flux is coming into lab space from outside it, virtual states, and returning into virtual states. It is a neutrino flux. See Fuller for the synergistics of explosion and implosion. They relate to vector equilibrium matrix. If the sine wave cycle has enough energy, it leads to pair production, the creation of an electron and a positron. The positron is an electron traveling backward in time, just as Dirac predicted. During any time interval, including the period of a single oscillation of a photon may be considered to consist of an infinite number of virtual happenings, each consisting of an infinite number of sub-happenings, and so on. It is much like the fractal nature of self-generation and self-iteration in nature. It repeats itself at all levels of organization. The photon itself may be considered to have a direct, nested virtual substructure, and the substructure is directly hyperspatial in nature as well. The photon itself may be considered to have a direct, nested virtual substructure, and this substructure is directly hyperspatial in nature as well. Actually, the electromagnetic field is not the most fundamental field, but is something that is torn out of or separated from a more fundamental field, the vector potential. Maxwell's equations and the normal concept of an electromagnetic wave and single frequency thus represents only gross envelopes of the actual forms and structure of waves and fields. The personality covers and distorts the essence or soul in much the same way. Neutrinic waves can be regarded as a circulating or spiraling wave in an electromagnetic field. This may well be the spinning wave of orgone energy identified by Wright. Neutrinic waves interact more strongly with strong electrical or magnetic fields. The degree of interaction increases nonlinearly with the intensity of the fields with which the interaction occurs. We presently regard an electromagnetic wave as a wiggle of nothingness existing in time. This is precisely the same as saying that a photon is an oscillation, wiggling, of space-time itself. Specifically, it oscillates in two directions spatially, one being the electric field direction and the other being the magnetic field direction. But since an electromagnetic wave itself constitutes a regular bending and flexing and curving of space-time, including both space and time, then the flexing space-time inside the photon can itself be further bent or twisted, and that constitutes a kinked or curved photon, a modulated photon. It is nonlinear, but our lab space instruments demodulate such a kinked photon into its linear components. Still, the modulation of a wave results in direct changes in the virtual structure of the formerly unmodulated photon, relativistically warping and curving it. A mixture of waves and frequencies must automatically possess, carry, or represent hyperspatial virtual patterns in the correct nonlinear medium that absorbs them. When we modulate a wave, we impress a time change on it. We differentiate it. We impress a differential operator function on it. In other words, to modulate an electromagnetic carrier wave is to add a hyperdimensional aspect, specifically neutrinic vector aspects of mind aspect. The whole affair can be thought of as merely shifting or altering the particular distribution of nested virtuals transported by the basic carrier wave. When we form a mixture of waves, we are adding virtual aspects, hyperspatial aspects, in so doing, because of the phase differences. This is extremely important. Complex mixtures of waves automatically constitute and carry hyperspatial components. Complex dynamic mixtures are chaotic, and if we can accurately control these hyperspatial components, we are in effect doing direct hyperspatial engineering and virtual state engineering. By using two orders of modulation on a carrier, we can directly affect mind stuff itself. Time spikes can be introduced across the body as pulsed voltages. They are modulated directly on the dendrite firing of the brain and the nervous system, providing direct and pulsed modulation of the neutrinic and mind field component channels of the mind-brain consciousness life itself. Hyperspatial engineering, virtual state engineering, curved space, photon kindling, mind-life consciousness engineering, and nested modulation are all the same thing. We directly engineer the virtual state, hyperspace, curved space-time, and the life consciousness loop itself, including the mind, with relatively simple devices that accomplish, transmit, and receive nested orders of modulations. For each modulation pattern, a particular virtual structure is impressed on the photon, which is the same as impressing a particular hyperspatial pattern upon it. Fundamental chaos shows up in cellular biology. In studying cellular electromagnetic bioactivity, the cell behaves as a system far from thermal equilibrium, deterministic chaos. In such a system, negative entropy can result, and order can emerge from disorder. For a wildly disordered system, large-scale order can emerge and stabilize, and the more chaotic the disorder, the greater the stability of the ordered patterns that emerge. Total disorder must inevitably turn into total order. Living cells produce coherent light with a laser-like activity. This coherence serves as a control for the metabolism of the cells, regulates growth, and fixes the reproduction rate. The cells exhibit superconductor behavior. Every living organism possesses a living aura with a virtual photonic flux. In this field, virtual protons are stored. The field continually receives inputs, virtuals, from the environment and is continually outputting biophotons, particularly in a near ultraviolet. This field, in which all cells are bathed and with which they all continually intercommunicate, tends to stabilize and cohere the organism. Pop. It's alive. Stress-producing metaphysical gas stretches and strains nature to yield into social evolution conformations such as the gas-filled plastic tube of the universe. R. Buckminster Fuller. The secret of the universe is that it's alive. Einstein's spherical model of the cosmos is a primary example of holographic universe. In such a closed space-time, each point inside the universe is also at the extreme end of the universe in any direction. Thus, the entire physical universe, Nuit, is totally outside any of its internal points, and totally inside each internal point, Hadith, as well. The total internal is identical to the total external. It is proposed that each fundamental particle having electric charge represents the dual closure of the entire physical universe. The gravitational field closure is slow and weak, and it is that closure which results in the so-called external physical universe. Harking back to quantum cosmology, we can speculate that our universe has many of the traits of a living thing. It was in a sense born from a hyperdimensional black hole in another stretch of spacetime in another geometric realm. Physicist Lee Smolin of Syracuse University has postulated that universes are born to strive and live and die. They change form little by little or evolve. A universe may give rise to a number of new universes throughout its individual history. As in natural selection, the offspring with the most successful survival strategies prevail. The whole collection of universes may be said to evolve. Drawing inspiration from Gaia hypothesis, he extrapolates that the universe may be a mother, hatching baby universes that live and die and, like the organic species of the Earth, evolve. See Omni, October 92, The Bubbling Universe. The universe, galaxy, and Earth sustains life through a series of interrelated feedback loops. If one applies quantum theory to the geometry of space-time as described by Einstein's theory of relativity, one can conclude that very tiny fluctuations in space-time are taking place around us all the time. As a result, occasionally a piece of our universe might bulge out like a weak spot in an inner tube, extending via a thin wormhole The blob would stretch until the frail link snapped, leaving an isolated entity of space and time disconnected from our universe, a baby cosmos, where the laws of physics might be quite different from our own. Coleman, Hawking, Baum, and Strominger have proposed that our own universe may give birth to offspring of the sort. Most are submicroscopic entities, a billionth of a trillionth of a trillionth of a centimeter across. A great proportion would pop away from the parent cosmos only briefly before being reabsorbed. But a few things might have the potential of turning into something much more vivid and impressive. Such buds can suddenly and extravagantly flower, turning swiftly into gigantic, rapidly expanding entities, massive enough to contain billions of galaxies. Each entity constitutes a full-blown universe of its own. How could a teeny-weeny quantum fluctuation bootstrap itself into a full-fledged cosmos? Reference the butterfly effect of chaos theory, pumping from micro to macro effects. With help from the dense, virtually inescapable center of a black hole, where the density of matter and energy becomes infinite. Just before matter in a black hole reaches singularity, a baby universe begins to expand. Our universe could have grown from the inside of a black hole in another universe. This reflects the mythic Kabbalistic creation story of emanation of Kether, the source from the three negative veils of existence. Darwinism applies not just to organic life forms, but over megacosmic dimensions as well. We owe our existence and physical laws to the trial and error evolution of untold generations of prior universes. A chain of mother and child cosmoses, each of them spawned in the nurturing depths of black holes. Reference Days and Nights of Brahma, Om equals 108, number of the universe. 1999 update. All is motion, without and within. There is no force field in the vacuum as such, but we can think of it as virtual rather than observable. A virtual electric force field exists in the vacuum, comprised of accelerating virtual masses, but not an observable field. This is beyond the physical and into the metaphysical domain. Observable particles can exist only in a physical medium. The ambient vacuum stress potential has a hidden internal wave structure. Its synergetic compressive stress reacts internally against atoms with their inner and outer parts. Reaction from the nucleus induces a tensile stress, which can be decomposed into opposing forces. The vacuum may become the central ingredient of 21st century physics. It is technically metaphysical, beyond the realm of physics because it is virtual rather than manifest. These causeless fluctuations in energy create force fields that emerge from nowhere. Particles flit in and out of existence at the threshold of matter. Virtual subatomic particles pop out of nothing and instantaneously disappear. Therefore, so-called empty space is not empty at all, but a seething sea of activity that pervades the entire universe. The vacuum sea is an inexhaustible reservoir of energy. Its permanent positive energy density is synergetically balanced by a negative pressure, tension. This relates directly to the newest concepts about cosmic inflation in cosmology. Inflation predicts that the density of mass energy in the universe is right on the borderline between expansion and collapse. Vacuum energy can account for some of the missing mass predicted for the universe. The rest is accounted for through inertia. Inertia is generated by acceleration through the vacuum. Fluctuations in the vacuum give rise to a magnetic field through which all objects move. As they accelerate, each particle feels the grip of this magnetic field, and the resistance is inertia. The larger the object, the more inertia. By altering the vacuum state, it can be possible to alter the inertia of objects. This opens a host of engineering possibilities. The vacuum plays a key role in structuring the universe. Astrophysicists say that the vacuum accelerates charged particles, sweeping them up to form concentrations of matter surrounded by vast cosmic voids. Philosophers were right. Nature does abhor a vacuum. Even empty space is seething with activity. It is the vacuum energy fluctuations which cause white noise in electronic circuits, and limits the level to which signals can be amplified. Might this be the metaphysical basis of the audible life stream, the sound, the word, and mysticism? In an interview with Megabrain Report, 1991, Bearden has some interesting comments on the collective unconscious. Jung's collective unconscious, for example, consists of archetypal enfolded electromagnetic structures acting in common in an overall bioquantum potential for the entire species. Gaia, the living Earth biosphere, really does scientifically exist as a common bioquantum potential with enfolded living electromagnetic structures for the entire Earth biosphere. The biopotential in a single body is an overall quantum potential that links and joins all the atoms and cells of the body. The spirit of the biosystem, if you will, is its living biopotential, its living quantum potential. We already know that a potential is everywhere, non-zero, all the way out to infinity. So the spirit of the living system is, in the virtual state, anywhere in the universe, and every when as well. It's all a giant hologram, not only in space, but in space-time. The entire universe is everywhere alive with everything. Note that if you simply examine the ghost forms requirement of quantum mechanics, this conclusion is inescapable. All life is eternal. Nothing is ever lost. A thought or thought form is just a specific dynamic Whittaker structure in the hidden electromagnetic channels of the biopotential. Thoughts and thought forms are real. They are virtual spatially, but they occupy one real space-time dimension, time. Physics and metaphysics share one common non-observable dimension, time. So long as physics continues to have time, which is non-observable a priori, then it must contain everything that is a structure or action in time. With Whittaker electromagnetic engineering, you can conceivably make thought forms to order and input them directly into the mind and long-term memory. If we view the conscious mind as a spatial serial computer, we have now found where the software is. For mind, long-term memory, and personality. As scalar electromagnetic technology develops, we will have direct access to the software, so to speak, for the very first time, and we will be able to engineer it at will. Anatomy of the Star Goddess, Quantum Cosmology, Virtual States, Energy Science, Scalar Fields, by Iona Miller in 1992.